1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so this is a Diamond D finished beef. This is one of our retail beef. A nice fat cap on it. This beef is 36 days aged. So, some really good flavor, nice and tender. We're gonna make this first cut. This is a boneless shoulder. So cutting through, we go up 5 ribs. We cut right under the 6th rib. And then I'm gonna cut the meat all the way to the bones. So that way it doesn't hang up on anything. Okay, where this is a boneless shoulder, next cut I'm gonna look for is this little piece of meat right here. So you can see where this meat comes through, and then it's gonna dip into the shoulder. This is the piece of the brisket, and then brisket nose piece that comes right up into that little armpit. And then I'm gonna start peeling right in here. Okay, so pulling through this seam, the next thing I'm gonna look for is there's an underblade steak that comes right up in here. You can see that seam. So I'm gonna cut just a relief piece right through that fat. I'm gonna stay right above that underblade. It's right in the seam. Okay, so there's that shoulder off. Next, I'm gonna make a mark right here and cut straight through that brisket piece. Get that chuck open. You can see where I made my mark. And I'll follow that with the handsaw. Then we cut these on the saw because they're a lot faster. You can bone out that whole piece. We'll cut these to size on the saw. They want soup bones. Okay, next piece coming off is the brisket. So I'm gonna cut this trace line right there. And then I'll use my hook to separate the brisket off of the sternum. And this fat line comes all the way out the front. So you can see this seam that comes right here. You want to peel that whole seam out because that'll clean off those brisket ribs. That way you're right in the seam and you're not going to hit any meat, and you're also trimming the brisket ribs at the same time. And then I'm going to keep my knife up, and then as I come around that rib, I can pull off that full brisket piece. Next, I've got the brisket rib piece right here. I'm gonna look, there's a little bit of indentation right here where that cartilage is. So with my knife, I'll come down those to square that off. And I'll trim off this first rib. Square those up. Now I'll cut the rest of the sternum off. That just goes into the garbage. I've got the kidney fat on here. We leave the kidney fat on so that the tenderloin doesn't dry out during the aging process. That'll open up so we can see where the skirt is. So this is the outside skirt for the diaphragm. Cut that skirt. And then the inside skirt is this entire piece right here. So I'm gonna cut just barely with my knife up at this top because I don't want to go too deep. And then from about here down, it's just all trim anyway. But the bavette piece sits right up here, so I want to be really careful pulling this piece out that I don't cut too deep. So if you do quartered beef, this upper piece right here would be cut in half. So we take it off first, so that way you can get the full inside skirt. So where this is a finished beef, there's a lot of intermuscular fat, which makes all these a little bit stiff. But I can just keep trimming back behind and pulling. I'm gonna be careful not to rip it in half. Make sure I get all of the meat off of those bones. That's the full inside skirt. Okay, and I'm gonna count up 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right on the top of the 7th rib, I'm gonna cut out. This is where the quartered line would be. So you can see if this were quartered, the top piece of that skirt would be cut in half right there. So I'll follow that rib until I get to about where the eye is, and then I adjust my knife angle to try and keep that straight. So I want to try and keep this square, and also I want to keep that level, so that way the short rib, or the short loin is going to be nice and square. These guys want rib steaks. Cut off 2 rows of short ribs. So if they wanted ribeyes, I would trim this out and then cut off these ribs and have boneless ribeyes. But they want rib steaks, which is a bone-in ribeye. So now I'll square that up so that way all of the steaks are going to be the same size. And these are all inspected beef, so we're harvesting all of this fat. Okay, so I'm going to cut off these feather bones. And I'll trim this down. Our trim spec is a 1/4 inch fat, so we leave about a 1/4 inch on there. Just want to make sure that there's still a little bit of fat for the flavor. but not too much fat. And then we also take this membrane off right here on these ribs. So I'll just score right under that first rib. That lets me get up and take that whole membrane off just as one piece. We're going to the flank. So this matambre piece comes off, goes into trim. So I just score around it. Now I'm going to cut the flank. So I'm going to start right here. Some of that edge. So right where this fat line meets up with the round, I'm going to start cutting my seam and pulling from there. So with this being a finished beef, there is quite a bit of fat. It's also 36 days aged, so it's set up pretty good. But as long as I'm cutting on the seam, it still separates pretty easily. So I'm gonna go to right here where the point of that hip is. I'm gonna turn the corner and then come straight down to keep everything square with the back of that steak. And I'm gonna cut out and try and catch all of this kidney fat at the same time. That way I don't have to go back and trim it again. There's a 13th rib that sits right here. That's the division between the front and the hind quarter. Right where this flank comes off. And then all that kidney fat is captured on there. So I'm going to cut this kidney fat off before I move it onto the table because I don't want to make a big mess. So there's all the kidney fat off. And then here's the full flank primal. So here's the flank steak and then the bavette or the flap meat that sits right there. Remember we took off that skirt steak that sat right on top of it. Next is going to be the beef tenderloin and the New York strip. So right at the H-bone, and then you can see this other muscle. So I go right to the side of that muscle and then right in to where the H-bone is because I cut into that hip socket a little bit. And then I'm going to hug all the way down that outside, follow this muscle to the point of the hip right there. There's going to be a blood vessel, which I used that little hole. That's what I put my finger in. And I can pull that down, finish cutting the head of this off. And as I'm peeling this out, I'm using just the tip of my knife, falling right up against those bones. So I don't have to go back and trim, and I'm also keeping all of that meat on the tenderloin. That peels right out. My next cut, right at this joint, so this comes and turns, right at that turn, I'm gonna cut in here to release this first. So once I cut in there, then from there, straight line. We cut right there around to the back. So the point of that hip is right there. So I cut right under that. So this is where the New Yorks come from. That short loin piece. So I'm gonna trim from where this eye piece is, straight across to straighten it up. And then I'm gonna look for, on this side, I'm looking for this little bone right there. So at an angle, I'm gonna cut right across here to chine these, the back of these, so we can bone them out easier. So you wanna make sure after you cut those, you can see a separation between these feather bones right here and then these ribs right there. Okay, next we're gonna take off the tri-tip. So tri-tip sits right in here. So I'm gonna trace where it is first. So that way when I'm peeling it, that fat line will just open up. I'm gonna be careful with my hook not to puncture the meat at all. So I go a little bit slower. Where there's a lot of fat on here, I'm just kind of going off of muscle memory of how this sits. When there's less fat, you can actually see the tri-tip structure on there. So I'm just cutting around to release that fat. This tri-tip sits right on top of the top sirloin, which is right here. So see, I didn't want to puncture any of that. So I just score it, and then I just pull that tri-tip piece out. So that way I'm not damaging any of the muscle. So that's still clean. That's all still clean. Next, we're gonna pull off the knuckle. So I'll trim out some of this fat. Right in this groove, I'm gonna look for the knee and for the middle of that hip. So when we cut off the fillet, we open up that hip so we can see where it's at. So I'll cut straight into there, hard line all the way to the bone. And then right here where it dips again, that's where my top line goes. And then you can kind of see this line right here that goes right to the point of there. So that's the separation between the rump and that knuckle. So I'll pull this top down right here. This is where the kneecap's coming off. And I can see some seam lines right at the very top. And then there's this bone skin that I'm gonna scratch to get under, and you can see how that peels really nice. So as long as you start this cut right there that I did, the rest of that bone skin will peel right off. And I'm just pulling and doing little cuts to release that whole muscle. Be really careful not to cut into the top sirloin. So now top sirloin's gonna come off again with my marker. Right where that open hip was, I'm gonna cut straight around here, about to where this tail comes off. So I'm cutting where that is gonna be square, because I want a nice square piece. So I cut all the way in. There's a little triangle of fat right here on the front that you can hook, so you won't damage any of the meat. And then I'm gonna use my knife to hug right up against this hip and get under that bone skin. So that way everything peels right out and I'm not gonna damage the meat, because I don't want punctures or slashes on that meat. So once I get it released, I'll cut a line on this back side. And then I'm gonna connect my 2 lines. And with my prep lines, it'll pull off a cartilage right off the top of the hip. You can see all of this is clean. And that cartilage piece came right off the top of there. So next we're gonna take off the oyster or the spider steak, which sits right in here. Again, I'm just gonna keep my knife right up against that H-bone. Peeling that out. Okay, next, right where this arch is, from this piece again, I'm gonna cut just into that hip to get a release, and then I'm following that hip line around. And then I'm gonna start cutting and pulling. And there's a little tendon right on the tip of the femur that's right here. So I wanna pull from this, cut that little tendon piece, so that way it'll allow for this to open up. Then I'll follow this around. Once I get up to where the point of that hip is, I'm gonna pull it really hard, which peels that whole piece out. I don't have to worry about cutting that out. Just give it a good yank. The rest of the cartilage stays right in there. And that hip comes off easy. Okay, next is the inside round. So inside round piece, I'm gonna look for this, the knee. And you can kind of see that coming through right around to this side. So I'll start with my first line up on the top. Then I'm gonna cut and peel. Peel that away really careful from the eye of the round and from the heel that sits right above the shank. And I'm gonna keep my hook right at the back because I don't want to damage any of the meat. Okay, next is eye of the round. So eye of the round, I'm just gonna score right on here, comes right around, and then right where that point was is where that loop comes around. I'm gonna start peeling it from the back, but I don't wanna cut too deep because the heel is right there at the top. So I'm just gonna get a little bit of that meat, cut and peel at the same time, and then follow my seam right up against that bottom flat as well. So there's the eye of the round. So here's the bottom flat. We can see the seam right here. So I'm gonna score right there. Then I'm gonna catch all this fat that sits right in here on this triangle. I'll peel the rest of this off the front. I'm gonna try and catch all of this trim. So next is the heel piece coming off. So from right where this tendon is, I'll cut until that seam right there, which under this is the shank, so I don't want to cut into that. Leave that intact. Pull this whole heel piece down. You can get the Merlot out of here. We'll put that. And then if you can see these two knobs of bone from that femur, so right above those, I'm gonna make a cut, and then I'll put my hook just right between those two, and then that's what pops that whole joint right open, and the femur will come right out. And then that just leaves the hind shank. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that actually. I can cut on this side. Okay, so boning out this shoulder is the first thing that we took off. My first prep lines, I'm gonna feel right here where the ball of that paddle bone is. I'm gonna cut along this seam, and I wanna stay on that paddle bone. So hard against, I can turn my knife around, peel that bone skin back, so this under blade that I'm peeling off comes right off of this piece. So one of the tricks I use again is just the back of my knife, because I don't want to cut through that. I just want to separate it from the bone. So I'm going to separate both of these sides straight out, and then I'll cut this under blade out on the seam. So here's the mock tender, this under blade. So that's all trim. Take that bone skin off. And then before I go any further, I'm gonna make a line right here along this cartilage. And then I can pop that open, and that's gonna help me once I peel this from the other side. Okay, next trim. So right on here, I'm gonna carefully cut. There's a tendon that I do not want to cut on here. So this tendon sits right in there. So you can see that tendon coming across. I don't want to cut it because that's what keeps this paddle bone attached. And the way that we cut this off is we hang it up, so that way we can get some more leverage. We can peel it off. So I'm going to follow the humerus bone right up along, right to this elbow. And then on this side, I'm going to come around, I'm going to leave a little bit. That tendon comes through right here. So I'm going to leave a spot for that tendon so that when I'm pulling, it's not going to separate and have that paddle bone fall off. So all these prep lines are going to make it easier when I hang this up and then pull everything down. And then I'll cut just right here on this back side. That way I can put a hook. So I'll put a hook right in there, and then I'm going to hang this up. So now from my prep lines, I'm going to go right around this elbow. Come back up, and then I can see how that muscle comes right down and around the front. So it just connects my two lines right there. Pull this glove off. Okay, so I'm gonna peel this down right here until I see this tendon. So this tendon piece right here is what I'm looking for. So I'm gonna cut that up high because that is gonna be our handle on our flat iron. And then coming around the back, and then matching up with that paddle bone. So I've cut right up to that paddle bone, and I can get under that bone skin, and I'll use my hook to pull that back a bit. Release off of there. And that'll pull the whole shoulder piece off. So after we peel that, then the rest of this we can either cut as shanks or just finish boning it out.